Okay, next up we have Gary Fitt from Save the Gouldian Fund. So as we all know about Gouldian finches, I'm sure, they're very beautiful birds that have their ups and downs in their population status throughout the Kimberley over the years. So Gary's going to tell us about the research that the Save the Gouldian Fund is doing, and what is really, what he thinks is really needed to ensure that the population of Gouldians remains sustainable and increases. Thanks. Cheers.
Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm not a local. I come from Brisbane, but I come up here every year. And I think I must come at the time of year when fires are at their worst, because we rarely see the country in good condition. We see it blackened, and we've heard more than enough to say that the fire regime we now have is not conducive to ongoing positive biodiversity and productivity for the Kimberley. So I'm speaking about just one of the species that is impacted by the current fire regime, the Gouldian finch. And as you can see, it's a stunning bird. It's an iconic species for tropical savannas, but particularly for this region, it brings a lot of tourists to this region. But it's a species that a lot of people don't see very often, partly because it's now relatively rare, but it used to be much more common than it currently is. It's a species that's very popular across the world in aviculture, but its wild population is now listed as endangered. Gouldians were once very widespread and very abundant right across northern Australia in tropical savannas, as you can see there. But if we look at observations more recently, in 10 years of eBird data, there are odd spots where Gouldians are seen. I know there are a number of Gouldians being seen these days in certain locations. Part of that is that bird guides now know where to take large groups of people to see Gouldians, and so you get these big blips of recordings of Gouldians. But the reality is that the species is still declared endangered. Gouldians were first listed as, or noticed to be declining way back in the 1980s, and they were eventually listed in 2000 as threatened in the Action Plan for Australian Birds. And it wasn't until they got to the point where somebody decided there were less than 2,500 birds remaining, and I'm not sure how anybody arrived at that number, that the species was finally declared endangered in 2006, and that declaration was reviewed and then extended in 2016. And through all the research that's been done by multiple groups, the key threatening process for the Gouldian is very much inappropriate fire, and I'll try to explain why that is. Grazing impacts are part of it. Trapping of Gouldians stopped way back in 1982, but the declines continued well after that. And so there's aspects of the environment for the Gouldian now that are not conducive to its population rebounding as quickly as you might hope. So the Gouldian Fund was established in 2005. It relies entirely on donations to support research and on-ground actions that we're able to achieve. And we conduct an annual count of Gouldians in a study area near Wyndham, where we've been working for a long time now, since 2008. So we've got the only long-term quantitative information on Gouldian populations anywhere, and it's showing some interesting patterns. We first started working at Mornington Station with AWC and donated a lot of money to AWC, and in fact was working there with Sarah Legg and Steve Murphy in the early days, but we soon moved our operation to Wyndham and have worked with a range of university groups. Wyndham was selected mostly because we rely a lot on volunteers to come and help with the work we do, and Wyndham is much easier for volunteers to get to than the Central Kimberley was. The mission of Save the Gouldian Fund is outlined there, to promote and fund research, and we partly fund a range of university research groups working on biology, ecology, conservation of the Gouldian, to implement conservation strategies that we hope will be effective, and to raise awareness about the plight of the Gouldian, but not just Gouldians, because they're just a species that's symbolic of a range of species in the tropical savannas that are impacted by fire and need attention. A lot of the research we've done through our Wyndham location was led by Sarah Pryke, who some of you may have known. So Sarah and her students worked for many years out of Wyndham, working on a whole range of aspects of Gouldian population dynamics and genetic structure, movements, how they use the habitat, how they moved around, what they fed on, and how successful they were at breeding. And all of those aspects in the context of how the fire regimes were impacting on the Gouldians. So a lot of information, a lot of published information about Gouldians resulted. We now understand a lot more about the attributes of habitat that Gouldians require to be successful. And I'm not going to, again, go through all of those. A key thing about Gouldians is that they rely on particular species when breeding, sorghum. They feed almost exclusively on sorghum stapodium around here during the breeding season from late January through to June, July. But they rely on a whole range of other grasses, and in particular, the spinifex species are important, particularly for Gouldians in the transition between the dry and the wet season. Most of the species they feed on are fire sensitive to some extent, but the spinifexes in particular, as Kingsley just mentioned, are one of the groups of species that need an interval of no fire before they will flower and seed. And so fire has interfered a lot. The fire regimes we now see has interfered a lot with the availability of seed resources for Gouldians, particularly at that transition from the dry to the wet, when you might expect that they would be able to find plenty of food, but in fact there's a 6 to 8 week period where a huge proportion of the juvenile Gouldians die through lack of food. Obviously, we're talking all about fire. I think we've made mention of the fact that fire is a natural part of this environment, and appropriate fire is critically important to maintain biodiversity in the tropical savannas. But the fire regime we now have in terms of frequency and intensity is nothing like the situation that most of this landscape evolved with. And we've seen many of these fire frequency maps, so I'm not going to harp on this. We know that much of the landscape where Gouldians exist is burnt regularly and with hot, late dry season fires. So the implications of inappropriate fire for Gouldians I've already mentioned. The impact on seed availability. The Gouldians are more specific in what they feed on than many of the other finches. The Kimberley has a fantastic array of finch species. Most of them are much more generalised in what they feed on than the Gouldians are. But the major factor for the Gouldian is the loss of nesting resources. Unlike all other finches, Gouldians are obligate nesters in tree hollows, and they're very fussy about where they nest. So I just wanted to touch on a bit of the science that we've supported over the years. Some work that Anna Weir did as part of her PhD showed that Gouldians don't mind burnt landscapes, but they like infrequently burnt landscapes. And the consequence of the sort of fire regimes we've been seeing is that Gouldians are increasingly having to move around to find suitable habitats in which to breed. We also, through Anna's work, know that the nutritional value of the key resource they rely on for breeding, the native sorghums, declines under higher fire frequency. And so that critical resource is less useful, and those two factors have led to reduced breeding success without any impact, without considering the reduction in availability of tree hollows. I want to talk about the work that AWC has done in the Central Kimberley in particular, and an amazing fire study, a long-term fire study that AWC did, and Sarah, who we already talked about, was heavily involved in a lot of this. but essentially setting up some huge study areas, 2,800 square kilometres in each treatment area, where they had an intense fire regime, which was essentially unmanaged fire, and a much more benign fire regime, where everything was done to manage fire appropriately, both on Mornington and with their neighbours. And as part of that, they monitored the health status of Gouldian populations in those two areas, and shown that in the extreme fire regime, there were significant negative effects on the health status of the Gouldians based on all the measures that they took, particularly around stress hormones in the populations of Gouldians late in the dry season. They were under significant nutritional stress. By contrast, in the benign fire regime, all of those measures were more positive. And in that area, the Gouldian population over the 10 years of the study started to increase. That's probably the best long-term example we've got of how fire interacts with Gouldians. And we've seen, and many of you would be well aware of the long-term transformation of fire management that's happened on Mornington and now the surrounding stations. So the Central Kimberley is a great example of what could be done if we could get that sort of coordinated fire management happening more widely. But to get back to the Gouldian and nesting resources, as I said, they're obligate nesters in tree hollows. They favour certain tree species, so they very much prefer smooth-barked corymbias in particular. And you can see one there investigating a hollow. And they're very fussy about the quality of the hollows that they use. They like solid hollows, very dark. They don't like things that are all broken up. They want to be in a very secure hollow. And so the trees that they really prefer to feed in, the snappy gums, become a critical resource. Mature snappy gums with multiple hollows, and some of them can have a huge number of hollows, become a critical resource, not just for Gouldians, but many other bird species. So in the study area where we frequent around Wyndham, we'll see a range of parrots, a range of ducks, a range of other small birds using those hollows in addition to the Gouldians. But that's what happens to a small percentage of those old mature trees with hollows every time there's a late hot fire. It might only be 0.5% of trees each year, but over 30, 40, 50 years, the availability of those old trees declines significantly. So a small percentage disappear. And when we transition from a tree with lots of hollows to a pile of ash, we haven't just lost one tree, because those hollows will be productive in terms of bird breeding for decades. So we're not just losing 1 year of productivity of those hollows. So one old tree going might mean 500 Gouldians won't be bred, or a large number of red-winged parrots or whatever. So when we lose one of those trees, the long-term consequences are very significant. We know that fire also stops recruitment of those trees. The snappy gums in particular are not fire tolerant until they're about 9 years old. So we're seeing, through repeated hot fires, lack of recruitment, and then obviously loss of the older trees with hollows. And over time, the availability of those hollows for the Gouldians has declined significantly. And there are competitors for the hollows that remain. The long-tailed finch will also use hollows, but it will nest just about anywhere. But it's a very robust, aggressive species. And we've got some great published data showing that in all the interactions of longtails with Gouldians around nesting hollows, the Gouldians always lose. We know that Gouldian nests are interfered with by longtails 10 times more than long-tailed nests are interfered with. We know that longtails of Gouldians that nest close to where longtails are suffer more interference, and James Brazel-Boast, who did most of this work, estimated about 60% decline in reproductive success of Gouldians just through the interaction with longtails. So what to do? Well, say the Gouldian Fund is a small organisation. We don't have the resources to be trying to manage fires over large landscapes, but the active thing we did do was to say, well, if nesting hollows are a limiting resource, can we put hollows back in the landscape? And so we put a lot of effort into developing artificial nest boxes that would be preferentially suitable for Gouldians, less suitable for long-tailed finches. And we then provisioned habitats with those nest boxes. And essentially what we were trying to do was to turn young trees that didn't have hollows into that critical resource for the Gouldians by putting our nest boxes in that environment. The great thing was that the Gouldians readily used those boxes in the wild. But we didn't know specifically whether that was going to make a difference. So an experiment was done over 2 years where one area was provisioned with 100 nest boxes, and as similar an area as we could find was monitored but had no addition of nest boxes. And the data, again, it was James Brazel-Boast who did that work and published all the results, showed very clearly that we were making a difference. We saw a major increase in the percentage of adult birds that bred successfully, more than a doubling of the percentage of adults that actually bred. And we also showed that they produced bigger clutches in the artificial boxes than in natural hollows. And when we combined the increases in those two effects, we saw about a 400% increase in reproductive success from the Gouldians through provisioning with artificial boxes. The key thing that data demonstrates is that nesting hollows were, in fact, a limiting resource for the Gouldians in those areas, that it was severely constraining their potential to breed. And so we set about a major artificial nest box building program, and over about 3 years we put 2,500 boxes into the environment, mostly around Wyndham, but there are quite a few in closer to Kununurra, around Ord Stage 2. We know that those boxes are being used. We don't have the resources at the moment to monitor all of those boxes, and we haven't been able to refurbish our network, but we've tried to do a little bit to help the Gouldians in one little area. The key point I want to leave you with, though, is that nest boxes can't be the solution everywhere. It's physically impossible, certainly for us, to make a difference right across the range of the Gouldian. And what we urgently need is exactly what this fire forum's been talking about, trying to get a return to a more coordinated way of managing fire, mosaic patch burning, coordinated across landscape scale. We need coordinated fire at the right time, in the right place, and at the right scale. I think we've seen and heard a few examples today of where this is starting to happen, but it's still pretty small scale. The science of how to go about it and the knowledge of traditional owners of how to go about it is probably still there. But is the commitment there? This is a real challenge, and it needs investment of resources to get much more widespread coordinated fire management working, so that species like the Gouldian can be the beneficiaries, along with lots of other things. That's all I want to say. Thank you.